Hey there, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Stronger with Time. I'm your host, Tony Battaji. In this week's conversation, I sat down with Professor William Kraemer. Dr. Kraemer is widely regarded as the world's foremost authority on resistance training, having started his career in the early 1970s. He was the first person to comprehensively study the female response to resistance training and has published more on this topic than anyone in history. He's the author of 14 books, including the authoritative textbook Designing Resistance Training Program and the Science and Practice of Strength Training. He's published close to 600 peer-reviewed scientific papers and more than 100 book chapters, all on the topic of resistance training. He has held professorships at the Ohio State University, the University of Connecticut, and Penn State. He's been ranked the #1 sports scientist in the world and is in the top 0.5% of Google scholars worldwide. He's the past president of the NSCA and is the recipient of their Lifetime Achievement Award. In this conversation, we talked about all things resistance training and females, program design, periodization, and how the response might be the same or differ compared to the male counterparts. This was a conversation I have been wanting to have my entire career with the greatest of all time in resistance training. Without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Professor Bill Kraemer. Dr. William Kraemer, thanks for joining me.
Excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
When did you first start studying resistance training?
Well, I think my history of resistance training really goes back to when I was a very young athlete. I know I'm talking with Dr. Jan Todd, the historian. She asked me the same question. I think it was somewhere in my sixth grade when I was a young individual. And I think the whole process was I was living in the state of Wisconsin, and that is the home of Green Bay, as the city there with the Green Bay Packers. And I learned that Jimmy Taylor, who trained under Alvin Roy, I didn't know it at the time, but he was a weight trainer and he played football. And all the Green Bay Packers, when you were a young kid growing up in that state, you were very much enthralled by that. And so what I really got interested in was the fact I was very interested in playing football. It became a sport for me that allowed me to grow. I think when I was younger, you got bullied because you were just fat or you're overweight. So you started to work out, and the bottom line was probably around 6th, 7th grade, I started lifting weights and trying to get strong and get big. Probably the same story by tens of thousands of people around the world. Something motivates you to try to improve physically. And I did. And then as I got older, as we got into high school and this type of thing, I was in sports. One of the things I found out early on was there wasn't a lot of information. We were very much dependent upon Bob Hoffman, York Barbell. We were very much dependent upon Joe Weider and the All-American Athlete and muscular development early on. So we had magazines. I grew up in a small towns, and there wasn't a YMCA and there wasn't a gym. So you didn't have the benefit of learning from somebody who actually knew about it. So we were very primordial when we were trying to understand how to lift, how to train. We did crazy type workouts. I mean, one time my good friend that all my whole career was training partner and football player in high school and college. We found that a boxcar weighed 90,000 pounds, here with the old units. But we said, well, we're going to do boxcar workouts. So we started to say, well, we'll lift 90,000 pounds a workout. And did crazy stuff like, well, to get a 1 million pound month, we need 67,000 pounds a day. So we just lifted. We didn't know anything about overtraining, overreaching. It was very interesting through a career. So eventually we fell into a whole training style, and you started realizing. I realized when I was in college, I didn't make a Big Ten team. I got hurt my senior year, and it forced me to go to a small school, which was what's called an NAIA school, and small, now Division III, the La Crosse State University, and it was the University of Wisconsin lacrosse, and they had a new human performance lab being developed. So since I didn't have a scholarship scholarship. I had to work my way through college. And they said, "You want to work in this new lab they're putting together?" And I said, "Well, I was a physical education, health education major." And they said, "It's a lab. You go study human performance." And I said, "Wow." So as an 18-year-old, I started in a human performance lab, and I then realized that nobody knew anything about, this was the early 70s, nobody knew anything about weight training. You had really very few people. You had Dick Berger, you had Pat O'Shea, you had a few people like that, and other people looking at a variety of different things. Delorme had done his work in the medical area, and etc. So right away, I was very interested in that. I remember telling my good friend of many decades now, Dr. Marish, who was a research assistant there in the program, I told me, he said, "Well, what are you going to do sometime?" I said, "Well, I'd really like to be an expert in weight training in college." And then I remember keeping that. And then I got into teaching and coaching on the high school and college levels, and finally went back for my PhD back at the University of Wyoming, where I'd done my master's degree in coaching there. And I had a major advisor. And I said, "Well, what do you want to do?" Said, "Well, I'd like to be the world's expert in weight training." And you think today, I think as an advisor, I'd probably go, "Oh," but he didn't laugh at the time. He said, "Well, then you got a lot of work to do." So Bruce Noble was my professor there, and ended up doing my PhD in physiology and biochemistry, and worked with Dr. Randolph Lewis and some of the top people that I was very fortunate to work with. And it took me into a different trajectory. So the long answer to your question, it started in grade school and it just got more and more sophisticated. But when I finished my athletic career, got into coaching, I started to realize I wish I would have known more when I was an athlete, how to train and how to do Olympic lifting and things like that, things that I then incorporated as I became a strength coach back in 1975 in the high schools, and then went on to college and that type of thing as time went on. And so that's kind of the long answer to your very short question.
Well, it's a 55-year career studying and applying resistance training. Let's fast forward 20 years to the 1990s, and you were able to obtain funding from the Women's Health Initiative. And what I don't think a lot of people understand is how expensive it is to do really good research. So you got funding from the Women's Health Initiative, and you did the first comprehensive study of resistance training in females. Can you tell us a bit about that investigation?
Well, I think the Pat Schroeder was I believe the senator out of Colorado, and they put this forth at a time in the United States. I don't know where we're at right now, but the bottom line is they were trying to promote the understanding of health benefits of exercise, and one of the features of an exercise program is musculoskeletal, and their Musculoskeletal Institute was interested in that. And also, there was a great deal of interest, too, at that time from my military work, that I had been in the military as a captain in the U.S. Army for a number of years, and did that. And we also were very interested in women and being soldiers, being warfighters on today's terminology. So we wrote a proposal, because we knew that nobody had really done a lot of work with women. And this proposal was kind of multi-pronged. It basically had a lot of different features. But the big thing is we wanted to train women for at least 6 months, this type of thing. We wanted to get beyond just that first 3-month window. And we wanted to see how closely they could actually get to the typical male norm, which the military had pretty well optimized. We pretty much knew from our work with men in the U.S. Army what the average male looked like. And so anyway, we basically wrote a grant. It had everything in it, from endocrinology to training to MRI scans, the whole 9 yards. Probably pretty novel at the time. Nothing was quite done like that at that time. And we found out how difficult it is. As a coach, I knew, training as a strength coach, I knew how difficult it was to really do weight training studies of any type, because I know how difficult it was to work with teams. And so we really created a strength and conditioning program. I was very fortunate to have a group of graduate students. Link Gottschalk, who had been a strength coach at Temple University for 14 years. He was one of my older doctoral fellows that came in at that time. So he was able to understand where I'm going. I had other people like Dr. Jeff Volek, who was our nutrition expert. We had a variety. Travis Triplett was also part of the program back then. So we had all the different dimensions. Dr. Brad Nindle at Pitt now. We just had a great group of graduate students and masters and undergraduates to create this big, giant training staff that would individualize every program. Now, the thing we did with women too is we also did a great deal of work with the menstrual cycle that gets buried into a lot of the studies, meaning we phased them for different endocrine studies. And that means you need to take blood and urine and you need to test. And you realize that, well, one of the things we realized in that study in our pilot work was that, first of all, it's no different than a man, a woman. Every individual is highly different. They have their genetic well, we call it in our player development program, we have our athlete complex. It's made up of genetics and nurture nature stuff, behavior, nutrition, all these different factors meld into who that person is. So we undertook that study over the 4 years we were working on it to collect all the data, train all the women, verify and do everything else. And I still have data that I need to publish from that study, to tell you the truth. There's so much, we collected so much data on that. And but the challenge is people don't realize that it is so, when you're working in research division one in the United States, and I'm sure other around the world too, it's very difficult because it costs so much money. I've written over $100 million in grants in my career, and to be able to fund the different groups that you have to have all the grad students, postdocs, nurses, nutritionists, all the things, it takes a lot of money. So you're running really a small business. And I never knew that as a doctoral fellow. Nobody ever warned me. I didn't expect I was going to be doing that. My professional goal was I was going to get my PhD and then go back to my old school at UW-La Crosse, teach, coach, do strength training research, and do that, and basically run my career that. I never expected to get into Division I research and grant writing and all the things associated with the stress of every day you wake up. It's about, what grant am I working on today? You do that for decades, and then in December of 21, I said, I'm done. And I quoted retired, which didn't work too well. Then and what happened, I did from Ohio State, and all of a sudden I'm back in Connecticut. And all of a sudden grants come in March and April, and we had $14 million of grants come in. I said, why wasn't it that easy but I had two young, great colleagues, Dr. Volek and Dr. Hayes, two different groups that we were doing stuff on. So that's great that I can see them be successful as they are, and the really peaking. They're really excited to watch people succeed. And anyway, so yeah, studying women. I'd been coaching women. My first experience in coaching women was in high school. I had to wall off the high school men's locker room to put the weight room was in the men's locker room. So I had to wall off the locker room in order to let women come in and train. And then at the University of Wyoming, when I was there in 1976, the same thing. You worked with women, train women, and it was really primordial. I've grown up through the entire primordial area. I guess what I should have stayed in that area, maybe I'd make a lot more money than I did just being a teacher and researcher. But it was an exciting research grant. Many people were involved with that study, still to this day remember it and talk about their involvement with it, because we had all these different groups and all these different teams of people to train these women. That's quite impressive. Some of the things that the women did were really quite impressive with regard to capabilities.
Let's talk about that, because you had the male norms of what the average male could do and perform, and then you undertook a study to train females in the same way to see what they could do. What did you find?
Well, I don't have the paper in front of me. There's a paper, Med Science and Sports, that has it all. I think what we found was you take women from a relatively recreational state, not untrained, but recreationally trained, this type of thing. Like you find a lot of them. And the military was interested in that because that's the type of, recruit they would get coming off the bus when I was in the Army. You'd get these men and women that, today even they're still worried about fitness levels in the military, probably around the world. But I think what we found is that women can make big pushes even over a 6-month program to meet many of almost the male norms. The only place that you get kind of difficult is maybe the bench press because of the lower amount of muscle mass in not all women, but many women. And one of the things you got to realize is that when you take men and women comparisons, you have to make sure you're comparing apples with apples and not apples and oranges. Because one of my doctoral fellows at the University of Connecticut, who's a professor at the University of Rhode Island, Aldisa Hatfield, was a world-class 165-pound drug-free powerlifter. Now she could out bench and out squat any men in our you'd have to find another 165-pound powerlifter to be able to say they're stronger than she is. So that's the case we found. But we had great performances and individual performances that were just amazing. We had one woman that we had a box lift that you did 10 minutes of box lifting. You took a 45-pound box and you had to pick it up to the height of what the military truck was, a deuce and a half, and you had to put it up there, and then you had to go back and get another one, put it up there. How many you could load on that truck in 10 minutes? And the average male, from all the work we did that had been done at NATIC at the U.S. Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine with the box lift testing, was probably about, and I'm giving average numbers from my memory, about 125. Well, the one woman we tested, she was about 6'2", and basically she did over 170 boxes in 10 minutes, just blew it away. And so I got to the point where one of my other former PhD students, now I'm wearing her hat here at Merrimack College, Tinda Sivak, was one of my other PhD students. She was a West Point grad and really amazing 145-pound lifter at West Point, etc. She'd spent about 8 years with me. And we really figured out in an extension from that original study is that if you put the right combination of women together, and then you look at our athletic women, you can put a group together. And I kind of found that, hey, you have women that their athlete complex is much higher. Remember, it's a distribution. So again, you have to treat it all on an individual basis as far as what their toleration, and that's where we got into from my Penn State work early in my career there. Before that study took place, we were doing a lot of work as the director of research for sports science at Penn State. I did a lot of work with different athletic teams, primarily some of the women's teams. We learned about the whole construct of really we need to have flexible, nonlinear periodization, and more importantly, that's where the germination happened with flexible nonlinear, that we'll be writing a book on this over this year. But I think we did more or less that study we did with Dr. Gottschalk, who did Link. We did a classical 3-month linear, back 3-month linear. We did a true linear periodization, but we had no interferences. We had school. So that's what they did. They trained, they went to school. They lifted, we monitored nutrition, we monitored everything. And it's the ideal scenario to see what they can do. And women can actually gain a lot. And so we found, if you look at all the different aspects, we did muscle studies, and we found that the biggest gains in the women that we found in our research there was the upper body musculature, upper arm. Just boom. The hardest one was basically the lower body. It didn't make as big a gains, that basically because they already they didn't have the window of adaptation, as Rob Newton always would say, and with the stuff he did in Australia back in the day, the whole window of adaptation was really large in certain musculature areas. But we were training. The unique thing in that study, though, that we did and was we were able, and I probably wouldn't do it today. We trained one where people just did upper body and no lower body. And this was really kind of a military thing of, well, what does that mean? And then we did two different types of progressions from from a very heavy periodized to a very heavy load versus one from a lighter load, not as heavy. So we're able to understand some of the roles there that basically fed into it. And I know there's lots of interest today. We end up writing more meta-analyses on things based on limited studies or whatever, but we were able to really say a lot of things about initial ideas about how muscle mass and lean body mass really are going on with regard to women. But yeah, and then everything we did with growth hormone, we did just so much. And we found one of the things we came out of that study, we found, for example, that the birth control doesn't really impact very much the GH response. And now there's other things too. You think about what is really evolutionarily protected, and that which is, you don't want to have a menstrual phase. You don't want to be sensitive to the menstrual cycle when your survival is related to it, like your immune function. We just did a study we're working on right now, showed that very little difference in immune cell response to the weight workout between men and women. And if you think about it, well, why should there be, if in fact that's a crucial thing that you have to have in place? But again, there's lots of limitations on any study you do, and that's the thing too. The big word I'll leave with your audience is that the word that I always teach all my grad students and people I've worked with is context. Everything has context. So I tell people, don't be talking to me about anything until you give me the context, because until I know the context, that borders the whole realm of, well, how my answers are going to come out. And, that's something you learn in time. And I think that's why experimental details are important to understand the context. And that's part and parcel of the difficulty with a lot of the reviews, even the meta-analyses and systematic reviews. It's hard to piece out all those. And when you do, it's still not hard. It's still hard because labs are labs are labs are labs.
And the context is everything, because the internet wants a very fast answer. What's the best? What's the easiest? Just tell me what to do. And the coach and the scientist needs to know, we need more information.
Right.
Just before we jump into the practical aspect of programming for females, I hear every week on really big podcasts that females haven't been studied. We're following male programs. And I always smile as a coach scientist, because I've been reading your work on females for decades. But it goes back even before that study from the Women's Health Initiative. I've read Jerry Mayhew's work in 1975 using resistance training and body composition. Do you want to give us just a real brief overview of resistance training research in females? And I think most females will be really shocked to realize it's not just a few studies. It's actually quite a body of literature.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way it is, a way it isn't. I mean, it's kind of a double-edged sword there. I mean, Jerry Mayhew and also, if you look at the early studies that first came out, and women came out in about 1973-4 era. Jack Wilmore did one with some athletes out at, I think it was one of the California state schools. Jerry Mayhew did a neat study, and it's always, again, the context, and then you look at the experimental designs, and then as time went on, more studies came out. But realistically, the whole construct of for me, when I was coaching in high school and during my master's degree, and I was very fortunate to be put in charge of Wyoming during my doctoral degree with hiring the strength coach. I hired a very exceptional strength coach back then, Mike Clark, who's now with the Detroit Lions and had a very great college career. So Mike has done a great job. The fact that the women would be trained differently, I think just didn't set physiologically. I mean, the menstrual cycle, yes. But our data and we have so much practical data too, is that a lot of times it had to do with the dynamics of training women to fight the stereotypes, learn how to strain, learn how to punch that set out. Not their failure, but I'm saying you need to teach women how to lift heavy. That was the biggest thing we had to do because there was a lot of stereotypic fears around lifting heavy. And that really carried on for a lot of women. I don't want to get big. I don't want to have muscles. And that carried on for a lot of the athletes through the 1970s into the 80s. And we fought that by really saying that. But the other thing compromised it was there are some women that are naturally hypertrophic, just like men. It's like my good friend, Dr. Rogel, an endocrinologist out at the University of Virginia over the years, we used to say it's important that you pick your parents well. I mean, you can see that your muscularity and everything else is something that you have, and you can develop to an extent based upon your genetic predisposition for the number of muscle cells you have, the distribution of fibers, your limb lengths, all the different aspects of the bioanatomy that you possess. But I think what we found out that all the years I did weight training in women, I never had one complaint by a woman who came in and said, I don't like how big I got too big. It never happened. It never happened that I had a spouse, a partner, I don't care what it is, come in and say, what did you do with my blah, blah? It never happened. In fact, the opposite was really the case. Wow, I feel in really great shape. I look great. This sort of thing. I look great in all scenarios. Athletes too. But I think the thing about it is for athletes, we have to train coaches. We have to teach coaches. Coaching education has been mentioned before by Meg Stone in one lecture a few years ago, is the biggest challenge because a lot of the misinformation, fears come from a coach who is scared. In the United States now, with name, likeness, and image, the athletes are their own corporations. So the coach doesn't want to disrupt the athlete too much because basically they don't want to say, well, I don't like you, I'm going to leave. This type of thing. It's very different now. But I think the whole construct of training women differently, I've never seen any data. We've got to train men differently. It's back to periodization, flexible nonlinear periodization. What are you trying to accomplish in a mesocycle? What are you trying to, in fact, achieve as a targeted, tested outcome? And basically, over that 8 to 10 week mesocycle, what are the workouts that you're trying to sequence to get you there? And then do the workout logs, which we now evaluate with a fine tooth comb. Are the workout logs representative of what you need to actually get there, or are you just kind of going through the motions, or like what a friend of mine says, playing weights? It doesn't matter. But that's where you have to have the plan. You have to have the athlete understanding what they're trying to accomplish, and you got to have the testing metrics along with workout logs. I mean, I went into a top program one time and I asked the coach, I said, where's the workout logs? He said, I don't know, they're in a file somewhere. I mean, that's not how it works. So we have a very straightforward way of understanding if the quality is going into the day and if we're making progress toward improving lean body mass and improving strength, no, and improving power and improving these type of aspects that contribute to the athlete complex, but it's also to the aging complex. And I can tell you that as talking with friends of mine that are all aging. Some as you look at my era, we're all fighting it. And like I said, told you earlier before the talk was, you got a lot. Injury is a major issue that can really set you back, and you got a lot of other aspects. But for the young athlete, yeah, it's preventing injury, and that's where we get into levels, and we get into the fact we have to develop muscle and tendon stiffness. Those are our two features we got to take care of, because those are the break points that we got to make sure don't occur. So yeah, people can talk about all the stuff, but ultimately are we improving the physical structure, the athlete complex, to tolerate, to improve, and prevent injury, and actually perform at a higher level than they did a year ago.
So let's go down that road, because an early mentor of mine when I was a young trainer would say that we need to train Tarzan and we need to train Jane, and they're not the same thing. And in more recent years, you hear this mantra that women aren't small men, and therefore, because of sex differences, estrogen changes, estrogen around the menstrual cycle, we should cycle sync, we should train differently around the menopause transition, and we should not be following programs designed for men because women are different. You've
Oh,
studied the differences, you've studied women directly, you've also studied the different responses. You're
yeah.
more qualified than anyone on the planet to answer that kind
Oh,
of logic
you
and
know,
thinking.
I don't know if I'm more qualified. I listened to two women who that's their world, the menstrual cycle. One is in the United States at Brigham's and Women's Hospital and MD. The other one's over in UK. She was in Finland, and I asked. They both presented data that there is not there's not enough quality menstrual studies. I mean, first of all, what we get is in a lot of the menstrual studies, there's more reviews on bad science of menstrual studies than there are menstrual studies. I told you before, it is not easy when you have to phase a woman. You got to know all the different aspects. You got to take blood, you got to measure the hormones, you got to look at ovulation, and you got to do it over a whole series of 3-4 months to understand what the trend is and what's going on. And then you got seasonal changes and all this type of thing. So for anybody to think that they got a handle on a woman's menstrual cycle as being something that is making them different from how you would train them with motor unit recruitment, which is what it comes down to. You're recruiting motor units that have muscle fibers associated with them, and you're recruiting in a very different way. And that's one of the things too. Everybody should know the size principle. I know a former student of mine at Penn State, Jeff Young, he said that's the thing that struck him way back when during his education. First thing we teach is understand that, and then people have debunked that, try to debunk that with misinformation. But the size principle is that basically it works for both concentric and eccentric type of actions. Noah Kondagino has written about it. That's been talked about by a number of top investigators. And the bottom line is, and I deal with neuroscience now and some of the NIH grant I'm doing with the brain and neuroscience and aging and all this. But it's a very fundamental thing that in order to affect your body development, we have to recruit motor units, and that means during the sequencing of workouts, we got to have heavy workouts, okay? And that means, but I think where some people think men and women are different is they basically have a different psychological your coaching ability. I used to be really good at coaching women and training women and this type of thing in the weight room, and I think that has a lot to do with it too. And there wasn't a fear of it, but there's an explanation of it. There's a motivation of it. There's understanding that, hey, here's how what we're trying to accomplish. Here's what's going to happen to you. And really, you got to integrate that. So I don't. The first time we were doing aging studies with Dr. Hackett and Dr. Newton, my good friend in Finland and Australia, with Dr. Newton, we were doing aging studies and teaching a 70-year-old woman how to do a squat. I think one time we wanted to paint the power rack pink. We anything you could do to realize that teaching exercises that are very foreign is an instructional thing. As an old physical education person, you have lead up exercises and you have to learn how to train and teach people. And so it's not that they can't do it, but have they been trained and progressed and taught properly how to do the techniques? And I wrote an inside the box on what you need to know before you lift the weight. And it's got a whole, I refer people to that inside the box. It's a whole bunch of things of what an athlete should going through his brain, her brain, before you lift the weight. And it really becomes that type of teaching and detail that's needed. But I don't see, are there different motor units in men and women? Yeah, it's based on genetic distributions. Some women don't have the same problem. Some women have more upper body strength and power, just size, muscle, because it's basically the number of muscle fibers you have and basically the type, and then it's a combination thereof of how they're distributed in your upper and lower bodies, and then your limb lengths are all going to impact it as well. But a lot of it has to do, like one of the strength coaches, Claire at Ohio State, she teaches women, well, how do I learn how to strain? Because if you're afraid to, we don't want to go to failure, but we want to make sure that you couldn't take that weight and do 7 more reps. And that's another thing that gets involved too. I created what was called the RM zone. And from a lot of work we did at Boston College with the strength coach at the time, Wes Emmert, and he was really great. We learned that there's an RM zone, meaning you say, okay, we want you in a 3-rep zone. We say 3 to 5, but if you can do more than 5, well, we don't want you going to failure, but you don't have to really go to failure because we don't want to get joint stiffness and everything else and stress. So we created where, a 3 to 5 zone heavy, 1 to 2 is skill, 6 to 8. We created these zones for the nonlinear type of program. And we wanted to make sure that when you could do more, you did, and you knew you could stop with 1 left. You could guess 1 pretty well. Now we got reps in reserve came out of that derivative. I mean, 5 reps in reserve, 10. I mean, you can't, even though I saw a review on it, and I don't know, I can't seem to get the same ICCRs on 5 reps in reserve that basically, because it changes. How do you guess 5 reps out? It still mystifies me. I'm not saying it's not possible. If you can do it, I think fine. But why? You want to be in a zone, but again, what we did at UConn with my late friend Jerry Martin, who was a fantastic strength coach, we knew that people are preserve themselves. They don't want to do it. They know they got to do this. They're going to do so much, so they're preserving for the long haul. And he used to have sliding reps to find that. And we did sliding reps. And that was something I had to learn, where you would do it so many reps, you get your total reps in a particular phase of time. But I think the bottom line is that we want to recruit tissue, and then we want to rest tissue. So that's basically one of the fundamental principles. We recruit tissue, and then we let them repair and remodel, and then we basically rest tissue. And you got to understand the basis of what type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers look like. And people don't really sometimes understand the basic molecular biology of type 1 and type 2 motor units. I know in my new exercise physiology book, we spent a lot of time trying to do that. Type 1 motor unit, type 1 fibers are just like they're little tanks. They got high density non-contractile proteins, Z lines, and everything else. They're titin, all the non-contractile proteins. And you could argue that titin is probably a contractile protein because of its role in eccentric action. So they're little tanks, and that's what you recruit all the time, no matter what goes through them. Now you get the concept, what Bob Stern said, my good friend, who's was the ultimate muscle fiber anatomist and histochemist, etc. And we used to say it's the hertz. So when you come down with an activation, you're developing an electrical charge that's coming down and just pulses of the theoretical engram coming down. There's a whole brain thing we could talk about. And basically what's happening is that hertz can be, for a heavy load, can be a very high hertz. It's got to get up through the whole line to depolarize the alpha motor neuron. And basically it goes through these little tanks. Well, by the time it gets way high, those type 2 motor units, and here's another thing that's really fascinating. Type 1 motor units, type fibers rather, they're homogeneous. But what you see is sarcomeres that look like this. They're interdigitating. We used to learn that everything was like this. No, not in type 1s. They're interdigitating. That means one sarcomere is interacting with another sarcomere. And, that's new in the last in the last 5 years, some great work down at Bethesda. And then you have the other thing is the extracellular matrix of all the non-contractile proteins is also very complex for type 1. So they're tanks, higher density, more complex intercellular, extracellular matrix, interdigitating sarcomeres, everything. So they take that big charge goes through them, and basically what happens is they can tolerate it. By the time you get up to the type 2 fibers, they don't have as many interdigitating. They're like we classically know. And they have very low density types of non-contractile proteins. Their extracellular matrix is very simple. They're made for bang, hard banging. So if you have those, you can see that if you have a lot of those, they're a very different type of profile than if you're like, no wonder distance runners only have type 1s. When you got to pound all day long, you couldn't do it with type 2s. They would break more and you would be tough. So when you break type 1 fibers because you do crazy things like, oh, I think we're going to do reverse benches today, and you never did reverse benches, and you can't brush your teeth, or you do heavy eccentrics and you don't progress it, you get all these things. So when it comes back to men and women have that same type of biology, that it's just who you are is what makes a difference. So I can give you comparisons of one man here could be very similar to a woman. And basically the only difference I've seen in fiber typing, and there's reviews on this, has been where women, because they haven't used it, typically have higher cross-sectional area of their type 1 fibers compared to their 2s. And that's primarily because they haven't been recruited. Once we recruit them, they start looking, the type 2s are bigger than type 1s. Now, aging men, that's what happens. You lose your muscle, and your type 1s start being bigger than your type 2s. You become a type of dominant without continued training. And even continued training, as my good friend in Finland, Dr. Akkonen, still works out, you're still fighting the apoptosis and aging. But I think when it comes down to, there's not been, they're correct. There's not been enough high quality menstrual phased women that have been phased for an entire year to really look at. I mean, doggone, you're in a metabolic ward, you're phased completely. Now I'm training you. And then basically you can say, okay, now I know this person's phase. And then I got to say, okay, well, what about birth control A, B, C? You got all these other aspects that affect it too. So we've kind of collapsed a lot of that stuff and haven't really seen that much difference. I know that basically our experience with premenstrual syndrome is highly different too. Some women train harder during premenstrual syndromes. Others, you got to back off because of symptomatology. So but you do the same thing with men too. It's a sequencing of workouts and readiness for workouts, and that's what ends up happening. So it all comes down to individuality. It all comes down to what you're trying to accomplish in your goals and your targeted mesocycles and your macrocycles, what you're trying to achieve, and basically what you can achieve with all the disruptors of the real world surrounding it. So it kind of falls into those things.
Is that the exact same message we tell our females who are perimenopause and postmenopause in terms of the practical advice, what to do in the gym?
Yeah. Well, I think the key thing is you deal with symptomatology, number one, if it's creating symptomatology. And that's where your endocrinologists, your teen physicians, if there's something that is basically impacting the symptomatology of the individual because of menstrual phase type of phenomenon. But again, when I look at changes day to day, it's nothing more than how are the symptoms related to a possible disruptor that day I can't do what I would typically plan to do. I have to allot to the fact that I have disruptors that occur from not enough sleep, from not enough nutrition, from many different factors in the menstrual phase can be a disruptor in certain women at certain phases of the month. But it's highly individual, and I've never seen it to be categorically the same all the time. But definitely if it's a symptomatology that's impacting from the menstrual cycle to actually the health and well-being of that individual, that's when you bring in your medical team to really understand if there's no underlying pathology related to that. But as far as saying women are different, well, so every man. I mean, you look at a male cross-country runner, And you compare them to a football player in America that's pretty different too. You got two different human specimens, and you got different profiles and different everything. And that's where our testing profiles, I can pretty much profile everybody with our testing profiles. And that's one of the things that you have to realize. Here you are. Well, who are you? So the needs analysis becomes very important to understand who they are, what their needs are, who they are physiologically, psychologically, nutritionally, that whole complex in order for you to successfully prescribe an exercise sequence. And then that can change too, depending upon the context of the world they live in too.
And you discussed that in detail in your more recent book on athletic profiling, which was very helpful.
Yeah.
Let your discussion about symptomatology really speaks to me, because when I work with women who are perimenopause and postmenopause, we hear the same comment every day. The same thing isn't working for me. What worked pre-menopause is not working now, and I'm gaining weight, and it's just everything isn't working. And when I open that up and really look at what's going on, it's the sleep disturbance, it's the hot flashes, it's the
Yep.
joint pain,
Yep.
and it's those symptoms that are changing the training and therefore changing the results. Would you speak to that for a few
Well,
moments?
I think it goes back to what we call as disruptors. And if you want to get stronger, you have to lift on it. You got to have heavy days throughout. We did some analytic. You need on a 7-day cycle when you're in a strength phase, you got to lift at least 2 times. You got to lift heavy. You got to have 2 heavy lifts. Might be on a Monday and a Friday. It varies. Quality heavy days that you need over that phase when that's the targeted goal. And if the symptomatology of any type occurs, then you basically have to, in fact, modify based upon that. You what we call default to a resilient workout. You recall to an elastic workout, to another aspect of the muscle stiffness and the tendon stiffness type of training. It's like we have people that we've done studies, and it just, can you do power day training with low power? No. Can you do speed days on playing for when you're out on sprinting? You can't run slow to train speed. So it's all based on the fact of what does the disruptor of the symptomatology to that athlete mean. And if the symptomatology is such that it's really repetitive, then we bring in the team of people to say, what are we doing? What are we trying to accomplish? And what is preventing us from that? And again, there's a lot of fear that's associated with things not feeling right. And then you have to have the sequencing going. And that's why you got to take advantage of days when they feel great. Now I can train power. I can train heavy strength. So you do a lot of diagnostics when you're really working on workout diagnostics, on testing diagnostics, on really, and it's hard work. And that's the thing with a lot of coaches when you're dealing with a lot of numbers, or you're dealing with individuals, you got to realize it's really your relationship with that individual and how you're basically doing your due diligence. And in our athlete development book, we call it out the 3 C's. Everybody has credentials, and then you have credentials, and then you have competence, and then you have commitment. Well, a lot of times people have the first two, but no, I'm not going to waste time tonight looking at her workout or their workouts and because it's hard work. And that's the problem when an athlete or puts their faith in you to do your job professionally. That's where you really have to make the decision, am I going to really go all in to this, just as you're asking the athlete to go all in and understand what you're trying to accomplish. And it's a back and forth too. It's the idea that I tell people I don't know everything. I mean, I really don't. You study, you look, and contextually you study it, and it's like your physician. If we treat everybody with, oh, take 3 Advil and you're done. I mean, it's got to be done diagnostically, personally, in a relationship, and then understanding that you're both committed to it. And then whether you get the sports psychology people in, some people are just how do you train somebody who really can't do certain things. And and you see that in exercise techniques. I mean, I was a big bench presser with short arms, a little T-Rex. I could never, I was very difficult because it's so big here. I could never do, I could never do a front squat. I couldn't get I had to use a bar of this. I had to do anything. So structurally, I couldn't do certain things for a lot of reasons, all of them wrong. But the bottom line is that you'll find that you have to deal with things from the exercise choices to how you're going to do things and why. And then also, again, our big thing right now, and the one grant we are working on right now, is sleep. Sleep is the biggest thing that you deal with as far as athlete making gains and making progress. We see this in military research right now that we're doing. It's the biggest thing to really understand how the body is repair and remodeling, which has been a big function of my interest over many decades. Repair, remodeling, and everybody repairs and remodels differentially. I think some people are just genetically made to repair very quickly and they're ready to go. And others, they can't, they never seem to, so what do you do? Back the workouts off? Do you do this? Is it the nutrition? Is it this? Is it that? What really is about the recovery process? And that's why you have to evaluate workout logs and have testing profiles that tell you the athlete, and especially athletes who are doing many different things, going out and having tons of decelerations on a rugby field or a soccer field, tons of decelerations, or pounding on a distance runner. Why are we doing this or why are we doing that? What are the demands of the sport that you're trying to understand also interface with their physical recovery and repair? And a lot of times you hope that the sport coaches don't become the worst enemy to your strength and conditioning programs because they can countermand things. But that's really what it comes down to. It becomes down to sequencing and really diagnosing and targeting what you're trying to accomplish and understanding what you can do and what you can't do.
In our remaining time, I'd like to ask three questions and you can answer them in any order you want. The first is something you've spent your career doing. What goes into a good training program for a female? Sets, reps, loads, frequency. The
Well,
second is the topic dear to your heart about how we sequence that over the months, which is periodization. And you've developed really unique models, which I use every day in my coaching. And then finally, are there any differences in those two with respect to males and females?
yeah, wow, that's hard questions because I first of all, the we wrote this paper that's not quite out on PubMed yet, but I guess it's out there. We wrote a review with myself, Dr. Radamus, and Dr. Frangala. She and he and I put this paper together on resistance training for women, and we've got a lot of ideas in there. I think what we basically look at is what, first of all, the target of what we're trying to accomplish over the macrocycle and the mesocycles that are found within, and what time do we have with that athlete. And then it comes to the fact that we've got heavy loading, moderately heavy, moderate, light, and very light, which become a cross section of different workouts. Dr. Tom Newman, a good friend of mine, a co-author with the Athlete Development book, and I have been doing this for years with his work at Yale and now since then, is that there's these different type of programs and there's whole programmatic things, and that's what we'll be working on for this new book. All these different programmatic choices that you can make to say on a given day, based on diagnostics, based on what you know, this is the workout we can do today from what you show me and what I can predict using analytics and this type of thing of what you can do today. And if you can't, then we have to default to another workout that you can do, or we send you home to eat, recover, and sleep, this type of thing. So I think the key thing is that what we've said many times is that you've got to get stronger. Most women in their programs have to focus on strength, however you cut it. You got to get stronger. That's the first thing, and we do that with many of the men's program. That how many men's soccer, same thing, or if you have certain sports in men's cross country, they got to focus on being stronger because they need their muscle and tendon stiffness, both functional and powerful. So we set actually what Ohio State, we have these kind of guidelines that realistically, for example, with our men, you should be able to squat 2 times your body mass. Okay. If you're, but after that, then you're interested in powerlifting, but you should be able to do about 2 times your body mass. Women, ideally about 1.75, 1.8 times your body mass. Are you going to get there? But that's what you're targeting to over time. So if you're a fresh person, as we say, and then you're a senior and you've never made any progress in that and gaining those things, we've got programs that just focus on mesocycles of strength and recovery, strength and recovery. But you got to teach people how to lift heavier loads. And when I talk heavy, I'm talking 3 to 5 rep is a heavy load. 6 to 8 is moderately heavy, 8 to 12, 8 to 10. That's many Modian's benefits. The big thing in the field right now is, well, I can get stuff with light lifting. Well, you can, but once you get to a certain point, it's not going to work anymore because you got to go beyond that to get those higher threshold Modians. You just don't get to them. So it's really a tough question. The first one, it really comes back to the needs analysis and what we're trying to accomplish with the body you are bringing in front of us and what your individual complex is and what we have to work on to get you from A to B to C over a period of time. So it really comes down to the fact that there's no secret programs. There's fundamental ideas about the fact that you got to get stronger. You're not going to get stronger unless you lift heavy days and certain major lifts in your program. And you're not getting more powerful unless you start focusing on types of exercises with plyometrics and power exercises that are going to make you more powerful. You then use the other ones to get at targeted injury prevention for all angles of the rotator cuff. We just don't do this for rotator cuff. We got a whole program for rotator function, all the different angles and things like that. So Tom Newman reminds me, it's always about angles and loading, angles and loading. Every time you change an exercise, as I said in our first book, Fleck and I said, every time you change an angle, you change the exercise. So bench this way is different than this one than this. And we went about looking at the analytics behind that. I was going to give this big talk down at NSCA this year in Kansas City, but I hurt my back and I couldn't make it down, unfortunately. And yeah, that was a left turn in my life. But anyway, the whole phenomenon is that the program numbers that you come up with are same millions that you have with the number of different card combinations in a 52 deck. It gets into the trillions. I mean, when you look at all the variables you got to deal with. So you have to really understand all the acute program variable domains. You got to pick the exercises that you're trying to use, where they are on their training experience. So we can pretty much get people stronger pretty quick. But you have to, it's training experience too. So it basically is contextual again for where they are toward their, now people hate when I say it, genetic maximum. Well, people say, well, there's no such thing. Well, there is what you have available to you, however you want to stem that. It's the amount of adaptation that you have based upon how high you can, because we all have, you all have X number of fibers. And there's no way you're going to get any more. Okay. I can't take you at 150 pound and make you a 220 pound player once you're 20 years old. And how big can I get? I'm not going to do it. You're limited. But I guess that's the first question. So I guess people can argue about the ideal program. It's about sequencing the workouts from recovery. Did I recover? Here's my program for a strength phase. We've got the strength. Now we're going to focus a little more on power. We've got that. We're going to focus more on injury prep and all that. It's all integrated. Now I'm saying am I recovering from that workout? Can I do the next workout? What are the gatekeepers, as Tom Newman talks about? We'll talk in the new book. What are the gatekeepers that allow me to do that workout? What do I have to know? What about my counter movement jump? What about my aura ring? What about my different analytics of sleep time? What about these different things that allow me as a coach to have them with the athlete or as a personal trainer to know am I recovered? Am I ready to do the next workout? And then what did the analytics predict is a good sequence for you? Like I say, we've got that, and then you get into red, you get into green, yellow, and red zones, and you can figure it out right away along the way. But it's all highly individual, and that's the problem with big team sports. People like to have the culture be the same, but ultimately you have to come up with a way to individualize the prescription so that basically you're not going to overshoot or undershoot. And then I remember one example where one workout log, and the 3 times they never changed the weight on a certain exercise. I think it was a military press, which was an ancillary lift. But I said, well, why don't you ever change that weight? You're stronger and everything else, but you never change the weight on your military. What you do? A lot of the upright rows, and yeah, and the individual said, well, I kind of like the feel of that weight. Well, if I wouldn't have been looking at the workout logs in the old days when we had paper logs, when I was reading them, I wouldn't have. I was a young coach, and I asked them, and I finally figured out: talk to your athletes. Why are you doing this? Well, I like the feel of it. Otherwise, I said, well, why don't we try? Let's see what it feels like to go up 10 pounds. So
Oh,
there's
that's
all
great.
things you got to talk with your athletes, and you got to, and personal training. That's all about it. The reason the first book we did on flexible nonlinear was so successful is because most personal trainers they're bored with doing the same thing, and there's not enough variation to keep coming back. And if you do it right, you get a variation for a lifetime. This type of thing.
I want to come back to that exact point, but just before I forget, I think a lot of women want to know the answer to this. You've suggested that we need to get stronger, we need muscle mass, we need power. The confusion lies with, can I follow the same program that is designed for a male, or do I need something unique? In other words, do females and males develop strength, muscle mass, power, endurance, tendon resilience across the lifespan differently, or can you safely follow the same program?
Well, I think first of all, I don't even think all men can follow the same program.
Right, right,
So
right, right.
I think the bottom line is the assumption off the bat is that programmatic things, there are certain things that we say are the same. If we're talking about, and it gets a little tricky when you get older because you got a lot of orthopedic limitations. You got aneurysms. You got all these things with aging that make the aging population more complex pathologically, and that's a different story. But when you're talking about young individuals, young athletes, we all squat, okay? We all learn how to squat, okay? We're all going to learn how to do our different exercises. So the exercise choices, we're all going to learn how to power clean. We're all going to learn how to do certain exercises. And can I teach them as a coach? That's another thing. So really the exercise choices are basically, there's tons of them, but the major core exercise choices are the same. I'm going to do some RLDs. I'm going to do a variety of exercises that are just they're asexual. They're just what you do. So and then when you come to loading is highly specific to your training level, to your progression, and to what you're trying to accomplish in the mesocycle from a beginner all the way to more advanced. So that becomes individual. And rest periods are another thing we didn't talk about, but sometimes you race through the workouts and now you got high pH drops and you feel like crap because you didn't take the time. So when we have heavy days, you're resting. Read the paper. You're going to rest 3-4 minutes between sets. That's why we have training groups that got to go around in a circle and they got to wait for the next person just so they get enough time to lift. And then you have the order. Well, typically we'll do orders, same thing. Typically we're going to do heavy, big exercises before little ones. And unless you're trying to get some type of strength endurance at the end. So realistically, I would say that to say that I'm going to do what would be unique to a woman that she would do from the domains that are not the same for the man. So it makes no sense. Analytically, it makes no sense at all. The core exercises are still the core exercises, unless you have orthopedic type of limitations. And that's why I say aging up here. What happens now if you have aortic aneurysm? So you can't lift heavy because nobody then can do that study and you don't want to kill them. What happens when you do have back spinal stenosis and you have all these other things? You got to find alternate exercises that allow and adapt around the context of that human at that point in their life. It's very different at this point in your life. Now, so the bottom line is, I just don't see anything that would say that will we do each individual difference in sequencing? Probably for a lot of other reasons, but not to say because you're a woman, we got a women's program. It doesn't make any sense at all to me.
Let's wrap up with this flexible approach to programming across a week. For those not familiar, can you just explain perhaps a traditional view of Monday, Wednesday, Friday to train for strength or muscle or tendon resilience versus your flexible approach? Now, I've used this since 2007, since your book, and I've used it across different population groups
Yeah.
where I want to focus
Well,
on different capacities. So talk to us about this.
what I said before is what we thought about. When I started working with some sports that were all year long, ice hockey, tennis, things that were just, and now it's become almost every sport. I mean, wrestling is all year long. I mean, you got sports, and so the only ones that are really cool to work with are track and field, where you have just like, you have a sequence of events even that go along by the season and competition cycles. But what it means is originally what happened, we had a number of different studies that came out that wave changes over time, and you had different heavies that have been out there. So originally, the undulating periodization was a term that was used, and there wasn't much undulation. And we said, boy, there's not a lot of undulation when you look at some of the stuff that you that you look at the stuff that Ree did, Matt Ree, and his early studies in JSCR and a couple others. So what we decided that, well, we want to have, we our first iteration was we're going to have really different workouts. So Monday we're going to go really heavy with a lot of rest. Then we're going to go we're going to go real light on Wednesday with a little rest. And then we're going to go moderate on Friday with intermediate amount of rest. So they're very different workouts. And then we would, even though you might have similar exercises, they were very different workouts for how the motor units looked at it. Okay. And then, so that was originally the quote undulating or nonlinear periodization. Where we started altering it was the fact that we knew that you want to go heavy on a Monday, but if you had not got any sleep and you had competitions and you weren't ready to lift, or a power day, there was a fourth one would be power. So you got the different loadings and you go through that. Well, we found out that it basically on that Monday, you weren't ready to lift. What do we do? Well, the nonlinear of it said, well, you're going to default to one of the other workouts that you can do. Maybe you take the light workout Monday and then you'll switch it into the heavy one here on a Wednesday. And so that went along, and that became the flexible nonlinear, where it's not doing, the mistake is it's not doing what the hell you want to do, excuse me. It's doing what you need to do for what you can do on a given workout to meet the goal of the training that's needed on your motor units. You need to train your body's motor units to be able to get stronger in whatever exercise movement that you're trying to improve, obviously. And you get basically then realize that you have that scenario where you then do that, and you have to figure out, okay, what am I capable of doing each day? And we did I think the NSCA did a whole in 2020, I think it's still online, non-linear periodization. It's a great video to look at. That's about 2 hours, 2 parts, 2 hours long on NSCA TV, I guess. But that's really what happens. So the sequence over 7 days sits within the sequence over 8 to 10, 12 weeks, whatever your mesocycle is for your sport or your whatever. And then you have to say everybody's going to be different, because beginners are maybe in a general prep mesocycle because they don't know how to lift, they don't know how to do that, they don't know anything. So they're in one type of mesocycle, and your other ones are in another mesocycle. And that's the big challenge today with coaching and coaching teams, is it's hard to have everybody on the same gear. And that's something that I think technology, with filling it in on the iPads, and the AI will tell you then what's coming up next and the whole nine yards. It's getting to that point when you're dealing with multiple people on a training stations. So that's really what you have with regard to sequencing is, are they, number one, what's the goal of the workout? Did I do it? Can I recover from it? And what do I do next? That's what it comes down to. And that answer is where the magic is. So that's how good the coach is.
How long does the stimulus last? Let's say you do squats on Monday and you are in the 3 to 5 rep range, and then you do a different movement pattern on a Wednesday, like a step up, same muscle group. Friday, it might be a leg press in the moderate rep range. Given that motor units are specific to the loading and the pattern,
Yeah.
how long does that squat have adaptation before you start to see atrophy?
Biggest question I get: how many times you have to squat? Well, you need to do that movement. You can't just show up every once a week. We think you got it in a 7-day cycle. You need to have that hit at least twice a week.
Twice. Okay.
Is that kind of our Lowell thing we've seen with athletes and some of the things we do. And again, it depends upon where you want to be with your squat strength, because if you're doing a squat, you're trying to get stronger in a squat. If you're doing a leg press, that's going to be a sled leg press. That's completely different. The mechanics, everything else. Yeah, you get stronger there. But again, there's a lot of specificity of what the motor units are trying to accomplish in a movement. So the specificity of exercise means that, when it was shown by Digby Sale way back in Canada years ago, that basically if you do a leg press, you're not going to get as strong on the squat as you did. But even though leg press has collinearity, did my biostat stuff, it has collinearity. It might be related 0.7, 0.6. It's not the same as hitting the squat each time. So you have to realize that. So there's a lot of aspects to understanding your exercise choices. That domain's a big one. But it usually, we say, if you're going to squat, you want to get better, you're going to have to do it at least twice a week in a mesocycle. And then you got to come back to it. We also found in some places, when we did a study in a Division III team, we could go heavy 3 days a week. We didn't even have to lighten it up. What we also talked about with flexible nonlinear, it's a mosaic type of program too. It's a chameleon. You could shift into cluster sets within it. You can shift into a linear phase for a while. It really is very open to any type of sequencing based upon what the needs are for that athlete to get from A to B. And most of the time, our biggest challenge is just get them stronger and get them more powerful and get them basically to develop the muscle mass that they need for muscle and tendon stiffness. So those are some of the things we have to be aware of.
Well, Dr. Kraemer, you've been very generous with your time, and your research endeavors over 5 decades have laid the foundation for so much of what we do as the coaches. I don't think a lot of personal trainers realize how much what we do, sets, reps, sequencing, frequency, the hormonal response, can be traced back to your work.
Well, thank you.
So,
you're kind.
Thank you very much for your work, your efforts, and giving up your time today.
No problem. I appreciate it, and good luck, good training, and realize that nobody knows it all. That's included me. You basically have to stay up with it. I'm looking forward to putting out more new stuff too. And it's always, everything changes. Nothing stays the same. That's the way the human body is too. Thank you again for having me today.
Thanks, Dr. Kraemer.
Thanks for tuning into the Stronger with Time podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing or sharing it with someone who would benefit from hearing this. And if you're ready to go deeper, the 9-week Science of Thriving course is available now. The link is in the show notes.